This is Letter from America. Today's topic is there will be and there should not be any Commonwealth membership for Zimbabwe unless ZANU-PF and the Mnangagwa Dizzy Pachinoi regime respect the rule of law and human rights. It was not a coincidence that CCC members, collectively known as the Nyatsime 14, as well as Godfrey Sithole, who was arrested with Job Sikala, have been granted bail while a delegation from the Commonwealth team was in the country to assess whether Zimbabwe should be readmitted into the Commonwealth. Granting bail to Nyatsime 14 and Sithole, who have been in Chikurubi maximum security jail for 5 months under trumped charges, was a cheap public relations gimmick by this Dizzy Pachinoi regime in a futile bid to give the impression that Zimbabwe respects the rule of law and basic human rights. The fact of the matter is that since 2002, Zimbabwe has consistently failed the human rights and rule of law test under the investigations by the Commonwealth as well as the United Nations human rights representatives. According to human rights reports, the situation today in Zimbabwe has deteriorated precipitously since the coup in 2017, which removed the late Mugabe. Basic human rights and the rule of law are almost non-existent in Zimbabwe. In a textbook case of a captured state, there is a systematic abuse of state institutions evidenced by the illegal harassment and arrest of CCC members like Job Sikala, Godfrey Sithole, the Nyatsime 14, and also the selective application of the law in the country. If you are ZANU-PF thug, you can harass, torture, rape, and even murder an innocent civilian. You will not be arrested because the police are under strict orders not to arrest ZANU-PF thugs. But if you are a member or supporter of CCC, you can be arrested on trumped up charges. You can even be arrested for wearing yellow colors. Police follow orders from ZANU-PF on who to arrest. Judges follow orders from ZANU-PF on whom to jail and for how long. The ZANU-PF Director of Information openly boasted that Job Sikala would be kept in jail until after the elections in 2023. The Commonwealth team that is in Zimbabwe now will assess whether Zimbabwe has made any significant progress towards complying with the Commonwealth core values. These core values are spelled out in the Harare Commonwealth Declaration that Zimbabwe signed in 1991. Part of the declaration affirms the commitments of the members of the Commonwealth to certain fundamental principles that were set out in the Declaration of Commonwealth Principles agreed at the meeting in Singapore in 1971. These principles have stood the test of time, and we reaffirm, these are Commonwealth members, they reaffirm their full and continuing commitment to them even today, this year, 2022. The Commonwealth believe in the liberty, and according to their declaration, according to this Commonwealth declaration, the Commonwealth believes in the liberty of the individual under the law, in equal rights for all citizens regardless of gender, race, color, creed, or political belief, and in the individual's inalienable right to participate by means of free and democratic political processes in framing the society in which he or she lives. The Commonwealth pledges that the Commonwealth and the countries that are members of the Commonwealth will work with renewed vigor, concentrating especially in the following areas: the protection and promotion of the fundamental political values of the Commonwealth, democracy, democratic processes, and institutions which reflect national circumstances, the rule of law, and the independence of the judiciary, just and honest government. Fundamental human rights, including equal rights and opportunities for all citizens, regardless of race, color, creed, or political belief. Zimbabwe had been a member of the Commonwealth from 1980 until it was suspended from the Commonwealth in March 2002, following the presidential election, which was marred by a high level of politically motivated violence and during which the conditions did not adequately allow for a free expression of the will by the electors. Electoral observers reported that the elections were neither free nor fair. The announcement was made by the Commonwealth leaders that included the then President of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki. The suspension of Zimbabwe meant that the country would be barred from Commonwealth meetings for a period of 12 months, with the opportunity for review at the end of 12 months when a decision will be taken based on the progress made by the country, that is Zimbabwe. At the end of 2003, Zimbabwe came under a review on its record on respecting the rule of law and basic human rights. The Commonwealth meeting in Nigeria decided to suspend Zimbabwe indefinitely because of gross violations of human rights and the rule of law. However, the then president, the late Robert Mugabe, announced on December 7, 2003 that he was pulling Zimbabwe out of the Commonwealth. Following the coup that replaced Mugabe with Mnangagwa in 2017, there was a fresh attempt to review Zimbabwe's membership. This was after some misplaced optimism that Mnangagwa would respect the rule of law and human rights. According to media sources in Zimbabwe, the British ambassador called for Zimbabwe to allow Commonwealth observers back into the country to monitor the 2018 elections, part of the bid to reintroduce the country into the wider international community. After being sworn in as president, Mnangagwa proposed that Zimbabwe rejoin the Commonwealth after a 15-year absence. Zimbabwe has formally applied to rejoin the Commonwealth after a 15-year absence. This move, which was announced by the Commonwealth Secretariat, was Mnangagwa's latest step towards re-engaging with the international community after Robert Mugabe was ousted by the army in November of 2017. Mnangagwa made the proposal in a letter to the Secretary General of the Commonwealth, Patricia Scotland, dated 15 May 2018, in which he also invited the 53-member international organization to observe Zimbabwe's upcoming elections of 2018. To rejoin the Commonwealth, Zimbabwe has to demonstrate that it complies with the fundamental values set out in the Commonwealth Charter, including the protection of democracy, the respect for the rule of law, and human rights, such as freedom of expression. The Commonwealth Secretariat pointed out. The membership process requires an informal assessment to be undertaken by representatives of the Secretary General, followed by consultation with other Commonwealth countries. It said, adding that the Secretariat is now mobilizing a team of election observers whose findings will form part of the Secretary General's informal assessment of the situation in Zimbabwe. That was in 2018. And that same year, the Commonwealth Secretary General, Baroness Scotland, said the elections, which are due to be held in July, including presidential and parliamentary and local ballots, must be free and fair. Baroness Scotland said, I urge the government, opposition parties, the election management body, that is ZEC, civil society, and all stakeholders to play their part in ensuring a credible, peaceful, and inclusive process that restores the citizens' confidence, trust, and hope in the development of and democratic trajectory of their country. This message, which applied to the 2018 general elections, equally applies to the elections that are scheduled for 2023. If Zimbabwe is allowed to rejoin the Commonwealth, it will boost access to international investment and aid to Zimbabwe, which is still subject to some US and European sanctions. Zimbabwe unsuccessfully tried to rejoin the Commonwealth at its meeting in Rwanda in June this year. Zimbabwe's Foreign Minister Frederick Shaw tried hard to lobby Rwandan President Paul Kagame. During an interview, President Kagame was asked about Zimbabwe's attempts to rejoin the Commonwealth. Kagame gave a textbook and classic answer. Kagame said, before you can impress the international community, you must impress your own people. This was a message directed to Mnangagwa. Kagame was simply echoing what the Commonwealth expected of Mnangagwa, that Mnangagwa and ZANU-PF must satisfy the people of Zimbabwe on the question of respect for human rights and the rule of law. That is, it was pointless to tell the Commonwealth or the international community that Zimbabwe was a democratic country when it was obvious that the same ZANU-PF government was violating those human rights and the rule of law. The Commonwealth has said that Zimbabwe should demonstrate its compliance with the fundamental values set out in the Commonwealth Charter before it can be readmitted to the Commonwealth. Zimbabwe's award-winning journalist Hopewell Chingono said he had been invited to meet with the Commonwealth visiting team to Zimbabwe led by Professor Louis Franceschi. Chingono said many Commonwealth benefits to ordinary Zimbabweans were denied to them when ZANU-PF angrily and arbitrarily pulled the country out of the Commonwealth simply because it did not want to adhere or to respect its constitutional prescriptions of the rule of law. Chingono said the withdrawal from the Commonwealth affected ordinary Zimbabweans the most than it affected ZANU-PF, whose only and main issue then and now remains what he called a bruised ego and political propaganda, if Zimbabwe was readmitted today or in the near future. He pointed out that based on the rule of law and abuse of institutions, things have gotten worse after Mugabe's removal, using many cases, including that of CCC members Job Sikala, Nyatsime 16, and the routine arrests and jailing of journalists for reporting and exposing corruption. But he added that there is nothing to be gained from shutting the door against Zimbabwe as a country of over 15 million in order to punish an incorrigible political party, ZANU-PF, and its regime in power. Chingono proposed that dialogue remains the only viable option on the table. He also suggested that there must be reform benchmarks to which Zimbabwe's admission must be tied to, like the release of all political prisoners and dropping of all trumped-up charges against the political opposition and government critics. Other issues that undermine rights include draconian bills in parliament, like the Private Voluntary Organization Bill or PVOs, the Patriotic Act Bill, and pending electoral reforms. He said there should also be a good starting point for the Commonwealth. This should be a good starting point for the Commonwealth Secretary General to do a test ZANU-PF's sincerity. The bottom line is Zimbabwe can never be readmitted to the Commonwealth unless it respects the rule of law and basic human rights. It is true that many young Zimbabweans will be excluded from benefits that come from the membership of the Commonwealth. But basic human rights and the rule of law far outweigh these benefits, and Zimbabweans will support the continued suspension until true democracy is respected in Zimbabwe. In December 1966, the United Nations imposed mandatory sanctions to bring down the Ian Smith's Rhodesian government after it declared UDI, or Unilateral Declaration of Independence. In response, Smith said sanctions would hurt the Africans severely. But Zimbabweans stood up firm in their support for the sanctions. The United Nations was aware of this. As a result, the United Nations set up a special scholarship program for blacks in white-ruled countries of Rhodesia, apartheid South Africa, and Southwest Africa. The same model can be adopted for today's Zimbabweans to mitigate the negative impact of the country's suspension from the Commonwealth. The struggle for human rights and the rule of law can never be compromised. All indications so far are Zimbabwe will continue to be suspended because Zimbabwe has violated its promised commitment to human rights and the rule of law under the Harare Declaration on the Commonwealth of 1991. The Desiree Pachinoi regime of Mnangagwa and other individuals will say sanctions must be removed and Zimbabwe's suspension to the Commonwealth must be lifted because it is the ordinary Zimbabweans who will suffer the most. Zimbabweans have a classic answer to this. Sanctions or no sanctions, we continue to suffer and die under a ruthless and violent Desiree Pachinoi regime. Kusikufa ndekupi. Where and when? Is there no death from political motivated violence in Zimbabwe?
This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe. Thank you for listening. This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe. Thank you for listening. This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe. Thank you for listening. This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis